So despite the fact that you know your fate and try to avoid it or somehow deal with it, it happens. And usually it does happen in the demise and death, uh, or in the case of Oedipus losing your sight, etc. So that aspect of tragedy, that definition of tragedy is more appropriate for rather than the um, number of dramatic events that end in death. I think that was Charlie who said that, and Jared said, "Isn't that everything?" So yeah, that would be a little too broad in terms of like if all our lives are tragic, and with every definition, if it applies to all, then it really doesn't have a meaningful scope. So that's something that you need to remember when we are thinking about universal concepts like love, etc. If it applies to everything in life, then it's fairly meaningless. Okay.
Kate then points out that Creon's intentions may not be as pure as aforementioned, as we see him display egotistical behaviors. In his speeches, he takes opposition to his edict personally and becomes fixated on making an example out of Antigone. He also seems to take the fact that Antigone is a woman to heart, as he repeatedly expresses his annoyance at the fact that a woman is the one defying his commands. Jack expands on this as he proposes a possible ulterior motive to Antigone's actions. On the surface, it looks as if Antigone wants to obey her brother as it is the honorable thing to do, but the class debates on the idea that Antigone is acting out of selfishness. She states that the dead do not take kindly to her neglecting her brothers, and so she would suffer to her neglecting her brother's needs, and so she would suffer as a result.
Brothers, neglecting her brother's need.
Needs, yeah.
Okay.
Should I continue?
Yeah.
Creon's leadership qualities are further examined as we see him exhibiting paranoia as he accuses everyone that tries to give him counsel of being bribed, which impairs him from making an informed decision. However, the class explores the idea that Creon's arrogance and paranoia are which comes about as a result of winning the war. He had just survived an attack on the city that was brought on by the betrayal of his nephew, and so he was already on high alert. Farid then posed the question of how we see themes in Antigone presenting themselves in lives today. Olivia points to the reaction of the people in different states when they passed laws prohibiting large gatherings as an example of people disobeying the law in favor of divine law. Some people still gathered in the name of God as they felt they were required to do so. Rance brings up the point that Antigone is the agent of change and says her actions are admirable as irrationality does bring change. This has been consistent over time as we see in history that only when people act out of the ordinary and sometimes in extremes do we see change. Farid does bring up the point that not everyone who is irrational and argues for change is admirable because the change some people want to see is potentially detrimental to society.
Did I say that?
Well, you said that not everyone that is irrational and looking for change is admirable.
Yeah. Rand, do you want to come back to that and say, I mean, that seems like a disagreement, but I didn't disagree with what you said. I was just saying that there are some irrational, quote unquote, actions that we observe in society today that might be, I'm not sure whether I said detrimental to society, but I always measure that you as people might not find good for the society.
I inferred from like what you said, like that you said not everyone who's irrational is like probably because like the change that they might want to see, like you just said. I am the one that just like worded it as detrimental to society.
But I think that's also a little bit of a political point too. Like we find people's irrationality admirable when they seem to agree with us politically, but when they disagree with us politically, that irrationality doesn't appear as admirable. That's precise. I mean, because being detrimental to society is not something that I can decide. I don't know what is detrimental to society, but some people politically consider, for example, being ruled by certain religious authority might be detrimental to society, especially if you are not from that religion. I think that's really the conceptual question that you need to ask here, is that as to whether religion provides a comprehensive enough unity, as opposed to secular state in which all citizens, regardless of their particularities, are part of a more general unity. Does that make sense? Any confusions? Any questions? Callie, Cameron, Caitlin, David? I'm just saying random names. So. Jared? Okay, continue, please.
The class comes to the consensus that although Creon did change his mind, his original stance on the issue was where he was at fault, as he opposed divine law and took up a position in which he felt like his power outweighed that of the gods, as divine law stated that everyone was equal in debt. Farid posed the question of whether everyone is in fact equal in debt now. Olivia gives the example of Osama bin Laden as an answer, as we see that in death he was not treated the same way other people had been treated because of his actions while he was alive. Antigone as a tragedy shows us that it is tragic. That it is tragic how we currently undermine law in present day.
So I want to come back to the example that Olivia gave for 1 second, if you don't mind. If somebody like, Osama bin Laden has a lot of family members who was in the United States, they might still be, I don't know. So if one of them would say, well, I'm going to find Osama bin Laden's body and bury it, how would people or how would you respond to it? How would it be read politically? How would it be interpreted? Sure, you must have ideas.
I feel like at this time of age, it will be more immoral to say no instead of saying yes. And I would personally be pretty surprised if, for instance, just say the US government were like, nah, you can't do that. We're going to let him rot outside.
You would be surprised if US government would say no?
Yeah, because if his family would choose to come over to or wants to go bury him, right, it's not their fault. It's not against the law.
Do you think that the US government would allow it?
I mean, the US government dumped him in the ocean so that specifically couldn't happen.
And that was the Obama administration. So especially Trump administration today, do you think they would allow it? Wouldn't it be perceived as a kind of glorification of what he did, glorification of his person, and so they would be opposed to it? Maybe. I mean, I'm just guessing.
I mean, yeah, that would be my guess as well. I mean, I think that there would be some people within the U.S. political sphere that would support, the family being able to bury him, but I think that would probably be seen as a pretty fringe opinion.
Yes, I mean, it's even worse in the case of Antigone, because this would be like if Osama bin Laden was an American and he betrayed the country, like Polynices, etc. So, Charlie, yes.
I think it would be a matter in the government today that would be just past the point in which they would actually actively act on it. And so they would all issue their statements as individuals and then passively maybe not stop a militia of a sort, or people who would serve the purpose of the guards in Antigone to guard the body and make sure that no one touches it, and they wouldn't condemn or stop something like that, but they wouldn't like actively say no one's allowed to touch the body.
Well, yes, that might very well be. I mean, we are all speculating here. And the reason we are speculating is asking these questions in different historical perspective might have different consequences. So all I'm saying is that as we are indifferent to Polynices, and therefore we say, Creon, why are you doing this? Just let her bury him, etc. But where Creon is coming from is this idea that since you betrayed the state, to bury you, to honor you, would be a dishonoring of the state. So all I'm saying is that you need to think of these in terms of its both historical significance, but once you make the analogy to contemporary issues, then you can understand why Creon is acting the way he is acting. So this is just my general point about tragedy not being on the side of Antigone or on the side of Creon, but understanding the tragicness of the situation. Okay. Yeah, Friday. Kate, you want to continue?
Yeah, so on Friday, the class gathered for our first hybrid session, with approximately half of the class meeting in person, while the other half attended via Zoom. Together, we continued our analysis of Sophocles' Antigone. We decided to structure the class with a discussion format where students would share questions they had formulated and passages they had marked in their earlier readings of Antigone. The class took a great deal of time to discuss the significance of the following quotation. Suffering falls upon the suffering of those who have perished, and not one generation is able to save another. There's no escape. Some god or other will strike these generations down forever. A discourse emerged from the examination of this quotation, with some students arguing that those generations before our own have doomed us, while others argue that it is in fact the older generations that are saving our futures. There was some lightly heated exchange between students. Fareed moderated this discourse and took care to point out the merit and hypocrisy that was inherent to the discussion. As Fareed pointed out, we as students in America have benefited from imperialism, colonialism, and have been fostered in Western institutions. Our ability to critique these powers has come directly from our benefiting from being educated in Western institutions. I don't think this was meant to serve as a critique, like on our critiquing, but it pointed out another nuanced layer of the discussion. At the end of this portion, no one openly conceded on their original points, and while the discussion had gone off into a tangent, the students were able to draw their focus back to the text. Here, we discuss the ways in which generational violence has shaped the events that occurred in Antigone, specifically tracing back to the actions committed by Oedipus, Antigone's father.
Okay, you had that pretty well. Thanks.
Okay. The class then asked several open-ended questions and speculated on the answers. These questions ranged from inquisitions about the Greeks' notions of individualism to more abstract debates on what death is and what it means to be dead. The class discussed the types of death in Antigone that Antigone experiences throughout the play, both metaphorically and with her decision to defy Creon's word. She says that she is dead then, and with her literal death at the end of the play. We also discussed what would happen if Creon had unentombed Antigone before she decided to hang herself.
Yeah, that was my point, and it was, you mean unentombed Polynices?
No, Antigone. Because didn't he entomb Antigone and like she was gonna starve to death there, and then she killed herself, and then he was like, "Go get Antigone," like.
Oh, okay. But yeah, okay. That might, yeah. I mean, I don't remember discussing that, but one thing that I speculated was, he goes and cleans Polynices and then burns his body and then gives him a proper burial before he goes and talks to Antigone. So in fact, he could have let Antigone do that before he killed herself, which would have made more sense, I think.
It would have, but
I thought so. That was my point. So it doesn't matter. It's just pure speculation. So okay, go ahead.
Okay. The class also discussed the significance of Antigone's punishment or lack thereof, depending on how you look at it. She was not immediately slain by Creon, which was kind of abnormal. This spoke to the significance of feminine disobedience and the status of women in ancient Greece. Furi also asked the students if the law which Creon used to justify Antigone's punishment was written or spoken. Isaac took care to point out that this varies among different translations. This led into a broad discussion about the significance of law, the word of the leader, and what the distinctions were between legal, moral, and divine law.
Okay, thank you. Good one. Reaction. What do we do? Clap. Okay, good job. Just clarify the last point. I'm not sure the issue were just whether it was written or spoken, but can you make a law for one person? Would it be a law if Creon said Polynices' body is not going to be buried? It is a specific edict, it's a specific proclamation, and he says that my word is my law. But it also depends on how that word is spoken. If you say nobody who betrays his or her country in ancient Greece will be buried, since Polynices is one of them, he will not be buried, as opposed to Polynices, and only Polynices will not be buried. So this is understanding the nature of the law, because not everything that you impose upon people has the status of a law, because law has to be somehow general, universal in its scope, and it should be non-discriminatory in its spirit. Because a law that concerns only one person would not really be a law, strictly speaking. It would be just Creon's personal desire, want, order, etc., but it would not be a law. Does that make sense? And is that because it's important, because like even in the case of but I don't want to speculate too much. We can come to this when we start discussing laws of nature, law proper, etc. But that's important. Now, Kevin Miles teaching a course on philosophy of law. Yeah, blessed.
I just don't know. I just don't like understand a little bit, because like I feel like the situation with Polynices was a special event, and I feel like the situation with Polynices was like a special event. Like it didn't happen every day that someone betrayed their city and then decided to attack. And so like I feel like Creon's edict was not necessarily only personal, but I feel like the general idea is that anyone who turns on their city should not be buried. I just didn't think that unless you're saying the way that he passed the law was like the issue, or yeah, I think I'm a bit confused there.
Okay, let's talk about that a little further in terms of the spirit of the law. As I said, Kevin Miles is teaching a course on philosophy of law. You might want to go listen to it. There is a sense in which the law has to be, at least in its scope, be applied universally. Now, what does that mean? That means, yes, these are the laws of the United States. For example, it only applies to citizens of the United States. But within that scope, within that universe, it must apply universally. It must apply to everybody. So when you make specific laws like this company is not going to pay taxes because they made less than $100 billion a year, that law cannot be just say this company, whatever that company is, Amazon, Apple, GM, etc. It must be any company. Now, it might apply to just one in that particular historical period, but its spirit has to be formulated as anybody. So my point was, and continuing with that conceptual distinction, it is one thing to say Polynices will not be buried. It's another thing to say nobody who is going to betray his country, in which case his country, will not be buried. Now, it might only apply to Polynices, sure, historically speaking, but that's the specificity. But the law cannot be just, because it doesn't, like, it's not a law, it's just a proclamation. I don't want Polynices to be buried. That's not really a law. That's like my order, my command. But law has to regulate the past and the future as well. Like not so much the past, but the future. So it has to say, from now on, nobody who betrays their country will be buried. Do you see the distinction? And that's also, you need to think about this in terms of lawfulness, the idea of law, because law doesn't just say this is this in a particular case. Now, it applies to all these particular cases and it regulates their future. Now, for Antigone, what is the natural law? The natural law, according to Antigone, the law of the gods, is like everybody should be buried. That's the law that she obeys, at least initially in her justification. Polynices is also dead. So she says Polynices needs to be buried because that's the law of the gods. But then she says, and that's why I was a little trying to provoke you in terms of her second justification, namely, oh, he's my brother. I need to bury him because I cannot have any other brother. So if it were my husband, what, Antigone? You wouldn't have buried your husband? You wouldn't have buried your son? Would you not have done that? In which case, you are not just following the law of God, you are following your own personal loving brother who is irreplaceable, as opposed to all other people who are replaceable. So do you understand the distinction? It is important. So this is an important philosophical conceptual distinction when we tell a story that is unique, just my brother Polynices, as opposed to I am talking about the laws that regardless of who that person is, should or should not be buried. Now, Creon's edict then goes against the laws of God. But Creon doesn't formulate it as a general law that will always upset the gods, because it's not just with Polynices. From now on, gods will always be upset with whoever betrays their country or their state. Therefore, whenever you follow the American politics and figure out that a certain law is made, just happen to apply to one company in 1 month, and then it disappears, then you know it's not a law, you know it's a complete manipulation of the spirit of the law. It's important. Okay, any questions about this? Yes, Isaac.
Not a question, but just to give a slightly different historical example, I was just reading about Joseph Smith apparently had this revelation where he like specifically gets a message from God saying that if his wife sleeps with another man, then she will be destroyed. But he, of course, is allowed to take other wives. So that's kind of a similar thing in that it's a very specific person, and it makes the whole the whole edict seemed illegitimate.
Well, did he make that into a law?
Well, he wrote it down, and then other people followed it, but yeah.
Yeah, it is complicated, the spirit of the law, but you do understand the spirit of the law, right? That it has to apply everybody under those circumstances. Otherwise, it is not a law, at least in spirit. It might be called a law, but it doesn't have that universality in its scope. And that's really the basis of all our resistance to the idea of discrimination. Because discrimination is only possible on the basis that the law is going to apply universally. So you cannot discriminate on the basis of their particularity. It relies on the spirit of the law being universal. Yes? Make sense? Okay, any other points that you want to bring up? Any questions, any issues? Anything lingering from last Friday? Anything about that we didn't discuss, that you are confused? So if you go to Moodle, the links to the class are already there. So if you want to look at the discussion again, and if you missed the class or something, you can follow at least the parts that are recorded there. Not all of it, but. Anybody who didn't bring up a question that they want to discuss?
I have a question. I think I'm gonna absolutely butcher the wording, but it's just kind of picking at me as like, aren't laws, like, I just find it hard to believe that any law is born out of someone who's able to have a universal scope, or like the intentions of the law aren't to be universal. The power in place who applied the law was just never no one acted against it, so it became a law.
Are we talking about the laws of the state or the?
Yeah. I'm just a bit confused, like, by that. I think I'm also just not really understanding the whole thing of like, I do understand the difference between like an edict or order and a law, in that like the scope of its application, but I don't know, it's just, I'm just a little bit confused.
Okay. I mean, I don't think this is a tangent in the sense that we might be talking about something else, but I still want to clarify what is at issue in the case of Antigone, but also in other texts. So let's just think the American state, the state of the United States. How was it formed? How was it conceived initially? So, like, is it the Declaration of Independence that starts "We the people"? Or is the preamble to the Constitution? I'm not sure. Anywhere, somewhere it says "We the people," right? And then it says all people are created equally, right? So this is the kind of the foundational law, Constitution of the United States. Now, when you read that material, what is your response? What is our response today? They say, what the hell are you? Well, we don't say what the hell. What are you talking about? Saying all men are equal while at the same time treating some people unequally. So this is the contradiction. Why is this a contradiction? Because we separate the actuality of the claim from its lawfulness. So it cannot be lawful, it cannot be a law that can be without contradiction accepted, because when we say we the people, you are talking about everybody who is in the United States. Now, then we correct, sort of, try to correct the law, saying like, those who are excluded should not be excluded. And we do that on the basis of our conviction that the law should be applied universally. Because otherwise we call it white supremacy, believing whites are superior to other people. So that's the problem with making an edict or any kind of specific law into a law. And that's the same spirit. Like if you just say polynices, then you are discriminating against other people who also betray their, I mean, you are positively discriminating, I guess. If anybody else betrays their country, I'm not going to not bury them. But that would be wrong, right? Like it would be wrong for us to say like, oh, this only applies to Polynices. Why doesn't it apply to anybody? You just have a personal something against Polynices because he is your nephew and you feel betrayed, etc. But if you punish him unjustly and all the others let them go or bury them, not let them go, then that would be wrong. That's the appeal to our rational understanding of the law, because we think that discrimination is problematic, wrong. Otherwise, we would be okay with it. And we always are suspicious when people, and as you said, very rightly actually identified, when people make universal claims while at the same time only speaking about personal things. So when like an administration makes a law and says, the president is not going to pay taxes. And if it doesn't apply to all presidents, but just to the president who happens to be president, we understand that it's not a law, it is just using the law to have personal gain. And we consider that to be against the spirit of the law. And that's like human, rational understanding of the structure of the law. So, and then it offends our sensibility, even if we observe it empirically, that yes, if you have money, you are more likely to get off from a crime, which is against the principle that everybody should be equal under the law. And yet we criticize a system in which people get off of a crime because they have the money to do so. It is wrong. It is against the spirit of the law. Now, of course, we need money to correct that, to get elected, etc., blah, blah. But still, like, rationally, it is wrong. Or do you, any of you, which I would like to know, and I would be very interested to know, yes, if you have money, you should be able to commit crime and get away with it. And if you think that just because it is happening, as opposed to, yes, it should happen, it's okay that it happens. Do you think that? Come on, somebody. Just for the sake of argument. Of course, people who have money should be able to kill and not go to jail. And people who are rich should be able to smoke marijuana wherever they want, and others who don't have money should go to jail. That makes sense.
Well, wealth is a sign of moral virtue. So you've already paid your debt
Okay.
by being rich in the first place.
Well, I would actually say it's almost the opposite. Like, I don't want to be like, what do you call class warfare or whatever, but wealth
I do
is,
want you to be like class warfare.
yeah, it's almost the opposite indication that if you are rich, you might be more likely to be criminal. But that's me because I'm like a poor person, therefore criticizing the virtue of the rich people who are so superior to us. So, well, you can be only virtuous if you work at Earlham College. You can't be virtuous in being rich. So, okay. Any other questions? I mean, does that answer at all? Like, that's what is a sort of conceptual distinction. Now, of course, you should be confused because it is not the case always. And it happens to be that we have these terrible laws, but you can only correct the terribleness of the laws on the basis of the fact that it must be applied universally. So something like ancient or modern slavery was never a law in the spirit of the law, because by definition it discriminates. And yes, it was the law, people obeyed the laws, they enforced the law with the police, they still do, etc. But that still is against the principle of the law. And so that's also like when gods make the laws, I think even gods in Olympian gods follow the same principle. They don't discriminate between Polynices and Eteocles. Everybody who is buried should be, everybody who is dead should be buried. So, you know, maybe Antigone has an allegiance to a higher universality. I mean, it would have been better if she hadn't said all the things that she said about her unique brother, but yeah. Okay, so any other thoughts about the play? Any complaints? Anybody who started out with Antigone now is with Creon, or started with Creon, or now with Antigone? I don't really care about this. I mean, but I'm just asking. See, I should not have said anything about the class. You are quiet today.
I kind of hate Antigone. I don't think you should ever assign it again.
Really?
Really?
I loved it. I think this was like the best 2 days class that I had.
Well, that's kind of concerning for your sake, I guess, but
Yeah. Yes.
no, I'm kidding. I don't know. I've had to read it multiple times this year, and I just every time I read it, I'm like, I think people read too much into it. I think that the analysis is I don't know if it's the best example. I don't have necessarily something to like pose as an alternative to put in the place of Antigone, but I definitely think, I mean, hell, I think the other Oedipus plays are better than Antigone. Really.
Oh, really? I'm surprised. I'm surprised that you said it. You seem to side with Antigone at the beginning, at least as the character, and were against Creon. It's sort of presented as the prototypical feminist text in the history of ancient Greek tragedy. So I love it. I mean, I'm not sure whether it is possible to read too much into it because it is significantly old. If you think that we read too much into it, you should really read the interpretations of Antigone from Goethe to Hegel to Judith Butler to pretty much
God, Judith Butler.
everybody.
Yeah.
So I think that I guess, regardless of what you think about it as a play or as a tragedy, the cultural significance that it plays for Western imagination is pretty remarkable. It's
I can't deny that. I just don't think it should. But
there are a lot of things that happen that shouldn't happen, but you're right. Anyway, I find it, I love its indecidability, whatever. So that I find it truly tragic because I'm not convinced one way or the other that Creon is right or Antigone is right. And I like the idea of not being able to decide. And that sort of, as you said in your protocol, that puts a lot of layers and nuances on the judgments. And since we live in a century of quick judgments, very quick judgments, I think that is a good antidote to restrain our judgments of what is right and what's wrong. Yeah, okay. But it's over, so you can just... but we'll talk about some of the aspects of it. So what I will do, I'll just take a break for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and further justify why I assigned this text and how we are going to read pre-Socratics and set it up a little bit, and then we'll move on to pre-Socratic philosophers. Okay? Thanks, Isaac. All right.
Reflecting her moral convictions, could that cause for generational change rather than generational violence shaping anything in the future?
Well, if I understood Rance's point correctly, and I'm not really sure that I did, Antigone was considered to be acting irrationally, and Rance implied, I thought, that sometimes acting what people perceive to be irrational might actually cause important change. So,
because would you consider her subjective convictions to be irrational?
I wouldn't, but some people do in the play, and I think Rance was speaking to that issue. But Rance, is that correct, or?
Yes, I think you did a great job of explaining what I was trying to say. Yeah, I believe I was talking about how how it can go from, what was it again? What was the comment I stated again?
Irrational behavior might be considered as actually a radical change.
Right, yeah. Yes, I mean, so we see that so many times throughout the world. We see, and we can see that with slavery as well. I mean, individuals, slavery wasn't thought of being, I mean, Black people weren't being able to have that distinct right of being free, but then it took individuals over time, and it took individuals over time to get that, for Black people to get that right, and also to become citizens here through America. So change, I mean, ideas that are only heard by the minority can one day be significant, and also be something that we see as, in today's time, we see as something just normal.
Exactly. So it's not that they are irrational. It's just that it might be perceived as irrational by the majority or the dominant discourse. So the point was, yes, Antigone is acting out of a principle, and it's not really irrational. Some people consider her, for various reasons, irrational, like Ishmene thinking that she should not go against Creon, and because she says, we are just women, we are powerless. So there is always a kind of quote unquote irrational dimension of the powerless speaking to the power, because we always say, oh, you should always get along with the power for your own advantage. and you should not speak against the power because Creon will kill you.
Mm.
And it is not very rational to endanger yourself.
Right. So the power would be those who disagree. Well, then the others, on the other hand, would be the mass, like the minority that would empathize with her convictions.
Well, that's what Haman says to Creon, that I hear all the people. So actually, even though she is powerless, she has the power of the people. And Creon says, well, I don't rule according to the power of the people. I am Creon. I'm not democratic Creon. I don't need to listen to people. So that aspect of it is what Haman brings up, like other people. But people don't have necessarily power either. So, I mean, their power is the power of the approval. And Creon doesn't change his mind because people think differently. He
Right.
changes his mind because the prophet says, you are going to be destroyed. But it's too late. He will be destroyed. And I think that's the tragic aspect of it. And generationally also, you know what the previous generation did, and you are going to live out the somehow the consequences of their actions. That's the kind of logic of tragedy. We are
Right.
always living our fate. Yeah.
So our tragedy would be coming from the previous generation.
Well, in the case of Antigone, that certainly is the message, but I would say yes, despite the fact that you're all like boomers, you are tragic in your fate that you are living out the legacy of the boomers. Jack. I will never forget that, you know.
I can remember it.
So the tragedy here is, you know what's going to happen somehow. You try to avoid it, it still happens. And that's actually the tragic aspect of both philosophy, I will argue, like whatever we read from now on, but also the tragic aspect of life. You know, you are going to die, you try to avoid it as much as you can. And that's the last thing that I want to say about the text before I want to move on. That was the after the first, I think, is the strophe of the chorus, when he talks about, when they talk about the human being. If I can find that for a second. Do you know what I'm talking about when he says many wonders, but nothing is stranger than man? This is line 335. And a lot of commentators, well, not a lot, but some commentators said, like, what is this chorus doing here? Why is it here, etc. So on page 335, it says many the wonders, but nothing is stranger than man. So that sort of makes a comment right after Creon was told that the body was buried. This thing crosses the sea in the winter storm. This is human being, making his path through the roaring waves. So that roaring waves, that shipping analogy, the ship analogy that Creon uses to, you sort of go through troubled waters, etc. And she, the greatest gods, the earth, ageless she is and unvaried, he bears her away as plows up and down from year to year, and his mules turn up the soil. So this is the reference to agriculture, to be able to take the, like, man is very skillful, and it's very, the word is dainon. Dainon is the Greek word for strange, sometimes translated as strange actually is a pretty good translation, uncanny, like difficult. Light-hearted nations of birth he snares and leads, with wild beast tribes and salty brood of the sea. With the twisted mesh of his nets, this clever man, he controls with craft the beasts of the open air, walkers on hills, the horse with his shaggy mane, he holds and harnesses, yoked about the neck, and the strong bull of mountain. So, so talking about the power of human beings on earth, and that what it can do with respect to the earth, but also language and thought like the wind, and also feelings that govern a city. So it can actually rule a city, master language. He has taught himself and shelter against the cold, refuge from rain. He can always help himself. Like, we are very skillful, and that's really kind of humanity always tells this story to itself. Like, we are awesome, we are great, we did so many things. And even today, like, you know, when we are talking about ourselves, despite the fact that we are even so ethical that we know how to behave towards animals too. So we are just wonderful. This is the kind of story that we always tell ourselves. And he faces no future helpless. This is sort of, I make my own future. I, you know, like, I conquer the world and my destiny. There's only death that he cannot find an escape from. He has contrived refuge from illnesses once beyond all cure. So again, the issue here is human mortality, that we might tell all these stories, we might tell all this technology, like how advanced we are, how wonderful we are, etc., and how much we know now, how we were grown so much throughout history, and we are much more ethical now, much more moral, much more open, blah, 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 yet it is mortal. And that also means that we cannot find a solution to our mortality, but not just because we are going to die, etc., but we cannot really hold on to this. And that gives a different kind of historical significance to it, namely, things that we accomplish are not lasting either. They disappear too. Yeah, okay. Just a second. Okay. So this is a transition to what we are going to discuss in terms of the beginning of philosophy, because I want to emphasize that there is this kind of awareness of human finitude and human limitations inscribed within the philosophical discourse. Now, of course, it doesn't emerge as a discourse of philosophy as such when we talk about pre-Socratics, because as you will read in the introduction, the term was used much later by Heraclitus for the first time. So they weren't even calling themselves philosophers. So nobody was sort of at the beginning like, okay, from now on, I'm starting the discipline of philosophy for the future generations or something like that. So it didn't at all happen like that. But it is a particular way of asking a question and trying to explain the world. That probably is the most general and correct, but not too specific definition of philosophy, trying to understand and explain the world differently. And it is called philosophy, as I said at the very beginning, the love of wisdom, as the two Greek terms. And it refers to a historical, and it always did, a historical period starting around 600 before the Common Era to all the way to Aristotle, but then later on as well. So that's the ancient Greek philosophy. But we are talking about 300, 400 years. And when we were talking about Homer and Hesiod, we are talking about thousands of years. So we are not really talking about a very coherent historical school or anything like that. Pre-Socratics, simply as you might have noticed, Socrates is Plato's invention as the first sort of proper philosopher. But of course he wasn't, because they are pre-Socratics, people who came before Socrates. And the first philosopher was always canonically is considered to be Thales, who is from Miletus, who is now in Turkey. It's the Asia Minor, but it was a colony of the Greece at the time. So that's the beginning, so to speak. But it is complicated because it is considered to be the beginning from the perspective of a tradition that we call Western philosophy today. And we always get, and as rightly so, questions about, oh, I mean, there were people before 600, before Common Era, and there were people who were doing a bunch of things and writing things, etc. Why is it that only whatever discourse that starts with Thales called philosophy and not other philosophers? Now, that's a complicated question because it appears to be a cultural or critique of the Eurocentrism or ethnocentrism of the West when you say there were other philosophers before Thales. It is true to a certain extent, but also true to a certain extent that Greek philosophy is something specific, and we really need to understand the limits of philosophy and then attribute it to all other ways of thinking that may precede Greek philosophy. So I'm not sure I'm being clear in terms of the critique, because people say, oh, is philosophy only Western? And I say yes, but that doesn't mean that people who are not from the West didn't think or didn't have ideas or didn't have critical thinking or something like that. But they were not philosophers, and that's not really a bad thing because philosophy means something specific. First of all, it's a Greek word. So if you want to use a term for what other people did, you should not use the Greek term because that would be the imperialist thing too, because Greeks would sort of go to other cultures and exploit and take everything from them. So it would be unfair to consider whatever happened outside of Greece as philosophy. Does that make sense? Am I like making sense, or are you like totally confused? I seem to be confusing myself a little bit. Anybody? Caitlin, clear? Travis?
Fred, I was just thinking that, so if that's the case, then what would you call what name would you give to the other non-philosophies then, especially now that
Well, I first of all wouldn't call it non-philosophy because that would be like the opposite of philosophy, and it is still defined with respect to philosophy. But whatever they are calling themselves. I mean, because philosophy calling other ways of thinking and imagining that thinking is a proper designation that can be applied to all of them, that would be wrong, because then I would read you just the way I read myself. Then I would interpret other cultures just the way I interpret my own culture, because Western culture, Western philosophy is a self-interpretation. It is sort of finding certain things in history and making it your own. They say Thales. Thales is ours. This is where our tradition lies. It goes all the way to Thales. It goes all the way to Socrates. When you teach philosophy in Western institutions, you start with Socrates, with Thales, because you identify them as belonging to you. And you call other people, like, you were giving the example of sort of Eastern philosophy. Strictly speaking, there is no Eastern philosophy, because whatever thinking was happening outside of the Greece was not philosophy, was not called philosophy, and we should not call it philosophy. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a follow-up question to this?
Sure.
So I imagine that there have been and will be many examples of academics and thinkers closer to the modern day attempting to sort of begin a discourse that breaks sort of the fundamental assumptions of the sort of thread of Western philosophy started in ancient Greece, but that some of those people may still identify themselves with the word philosophy. So,
Yeah.
and want to be considered part of that field as not as it was, you know, conceived by the Greeks, but as it's thought of today as this sort of like broad academic field that's taught in universities all over the world. And so sort of how do you interpret that sort of more contemporary use of the word and its application to sort of alternative modes of academic thinking?
That's a very great question. Like, so some people do like Eastern philosophy within the Western philosophical institutions, like universities in Great Britain, the United States, Germany, etc. They have Eastern philosophy. Now, Eastern philosophy is a wrong term. It's an imperialist term. It appropriates whatever Eastern is to Western philosophy because the word itself is Greek. Now, you can say, well, a lot of people can love wisdom. You don't have to be Western to love wisdom. Yes, absolutely. But it was in the West that it was called love of wisdom. It was use these terms. Now, when you are doing that, of course, you are talking about the university, which is a particular Western invention of imperialism that somehow appropriates other discourses into itself. Yes, you have to call yourself that within the Western educational system today. And yeah, I mean, it might be false, but it's inescapable, it's inevitable. Now, I mean, maybe names don't mean as much, but what you are really doing, because if you are interpreting Eastern philosophy with respect to the tools of philosophy of the West and calling it philosophy, then you are really missing something. Then you are really reducing the other to yourself. And that would be problematic. So it is a complicated issue. Now, some people say quite simple-mindedly, I believe, oh, that's philosophy too. As if, oh, you other cultures, you are just as philosophical as we are. You are cool. Yours counts as philosophy as well. As if that's kind of a generous thing to say to other cultures. Like, you can philosophize too. You are capable of that too, which is actually problematic because you are reducing whatever they are doing to what you are doing, and you're always doing it a little bit worse, obviously, but still, you can think or something. And it is the same with respect to science, for example. Science as a discourse, as a particular methodology, is Western. Now, that doesn't make it wrong. It's just that it doesn't allow us to understand the difference between different ways of knowing and scientific knowledge. We consider that, oh, that is science too, as if by allowing others to use your own label, you are giving them some permission to be legitimate. And it is the same with philosophy. Like, I'm saying, like, oh, you can be philosophical too, because you are good enough to be elevated to the status of philosophy. And I think that's patronizing, that's problematic as a discourse. Now, I guess our aim is here to understand a peculiar way of thinking. But more than that, as you read the introduction, it is not just a peculiar way of reading, but a peculiar way of self-interpretation. Western scholars interpreting ancient Greek philosophy in a certain way, constituting their own identity. And philosophical tradition is always a matter of interpretation. What is included? What is excluded? Who is main figure? Who is a minor figure? Which ideas are important? Which ideas are not important? Why is it metaphysics? Why it is epistemology? Why is it less important in ethics? Blah, blah. All these questions constitute Western tradition, which includes philosophical tradition, but at the same time, it is the scientific tradition, because science today, as far as I follow it, sort of goes as, I mean, doesn't go very much historically, but uses the term Aristotle as that which is everything wrong with the previous science. Aristotelian worldview, that's just wrong. And science has disproved Aristotle as completely wrong about his assumptions, etc. But that's still the tradition that it is talking about. I guess it goes all the way back to Aristotle, but it doesn't say like, by the way, Confucius was doing something and that was completely wrong, ha ha ha. Doesn't do that. So it takes Aristotle as its first proto-scientific beginning. So therefore, there is really not even a meaningful distinction at the time, and the introduction makes this clear, between science, astrology, philosophy, engineering, agriculture, etc. This is a particular way of relating to the world. And the tradition that we are part of is telling this story as, this is the first time human beings start to think about explaining things in terms of observation, in terms of argument and evidence, rather than myth. So the philosophical myth is that philosophy separated itself from myth. That is what philosophy says to itself. Like, oh, I only take Thales because Thales, the first philosophers from Miletus, which is in Turkey, by the way. So last year, or maybe 2 years ago, or maybe last summer, not this past summer, but the summer before, we had a May term, or not May term now anymore, like epic thing to Turkey. So we traveled to all these sites, to Miletus, which is in southern Turkey right now. I mean, always is, but like now it's called southern Turkey. And then Ephesus and Assos, where Aristotle lived, etc. So it's in Miletus. Thales said that the water is the origin of everything. Now, first of all, it's quite disappointing for someone to hear that water is the origin of everything. It sounds like a little mythical and sort of not very great explanation or something like that. But we own it. People own it and say like, yes, even though Thales might have said something like that, that's the first time he tried to explain things, not like Homer, not like Hesiod, in terms of God, in terms of muses, in terms of theological explanations. For the first part, he tried to explain the origin of everything in terms of something that we can all see, agree or disagree, and critically analyze. This is as philosophy sees itself separating from mythical, traditional Greek stories. Now, is this true? That question is not even as relevant as people started writing the history like that. It's a little bit like, all the other concepts that we use, and then we discover they are not actually real concepts, but it doesn't matter because we believed them and constructed the story along those lines for centuries. And so philosophy as a discourse understands its own history, starting with Thales, starting with the idea of the water being the origin of everything. And they say, wow, for the first time, somebody thought something can be the origin of everything, and tried to give an explanation of what he is observing in the world, and try to explain the world in terms of not some metaphysical, some other realm, but in terms of this realm, something that we can observe. That seems to be the discourse about how philosophy understands itself. Okay, this was a little bit, I don't know, in my head it was a little confusing, but any questions?
Well, I don't know if this is a question, but I was thinking about this guy, Alan Watts, I think,
Uh-huh.
and how like he got into well, let's call it Eastern philosophy because I don't know what else to call it, and how a lot of people say that he's not a real philosopher because of that. Like, does that, how would you, like, would it mean that he's like contaminating kind of like,
But again, that really depends on the way in which you understand the term philosophy. If you understand it as a positive value, that is the greatest thing that you can achieve, and then exclude somebody from that, yes, that would be like thinking that he is contaminating philosophical discourse. And that's what institutions do. That's what power does. That's a sort of interpretation of power. And in order to dismantle that power, you might strategically insist that, no, that's philosophy too. It is as valuable as you are. But you are still leaving the measuring stick of value to philosophy. You are still evaluating it in terms of, because it has the most power, most money, most institutionalized. A lot of departments are called philosophy. So they are going to determine what is philosophy, what is not. And when you are sort of trying to make a discourse into a philosophy, you are saying, I accept your standards. Your standards are wonderful because philosophy is great. I just want to be counted as philosopher too. And that I find problematic precisely because by trying to make yourself into philosophy, you are actually strengthening a discourse that might not be justified to be so strong. And that's the paradox here. So for me, something not being a philosophy, that's great. That's good. That's outside of philosophy. Maybe there is a different way of thinking. But for someone who believes that philosophy is the greatest way of thinking, of course, Eastern philosophy, depending on their political perspective, may or may not count as proper philosophy. If they respect it, they will say, oh, that counts as proper philosophy. And if they don't respect it, they will say, oh, no, it doesn't count. But in either case, you accepted the value of philosophy. So for us, yeah, go ahead, Travis. Sorry.
I wanted to understand something. You said that when the person said that water is the origin of everything, that was like the first instance of like philosophy. But
Yeah, that's the first philosopher, like traditionally now called, I mean, he didn't call himself philosopher, but now it is called as the first philosopher, Thales, who was in Miletus in Greece. I mean, now in Turkey, but ancient Greece.
And you also said that that's the first time they try to explain stuff outside of like religion. So
yeah,
then
myth.
So then could like a meaning for philosophy be that to explain things outside of religion or outside of myth?
That is how philosophy explains itself. Yes, that's how. But I'm saying like we need to be careful. This is how tradition understands itself. That's how tradition defines itself. Western philosophy today, this book that we are going to read, whatever I am teaching, is a particular interpretation of history. And that history includes Thales as the first original philosopher. So it is complicated because we don't want to just make it like, oh, as if it is clear that the history of philosophy is already written and it's already clear. Thales was the first philosopher, blah, blah. Yes, but that's all from a perspective of Western philosophy that we define today. For centuries, actually, but, today. So I want to complicate our simple-minded reading of history as if this is all decided the moment that it was started. Like Thales didn't call himself a philosopher. He was just like looking at things, and he was trying to give explanation of things. And he didn't, like, we don't even, I mean, there are other complications in the sense that we don't even have anything written by him that survived. So these pre-Socratic philosophers are mostly through fragments, which are quotations in other texts, subsequent texts after Plato, but also testimonies. Like Aristotle says, Heraclitus said this, and you don't really know whether he actually said it or whether Aristotle is quoting it correctly, etc. But when you read the specific difficulties of how to interpret a tradition, how do we understand ourselves, how do we articulate ourselves, and Europeans especially, but subsequently the United States, has this connection to the ancient Greece as the origin of their civilization. That's everything that's coming from the ancient Greek. So that's a story. I mean, I'm not saying that's a story that it's necessarily all wrong, but it is a story. It is a constructed self-understanding, like who we are in the West today is like, oh, we are the tradition that belongs to Thales and Socrates and pre-Socratics, etc. And almost like we got lost a little bit in the Middle Ages, but like the Arabs were really good to preserve these sources, so we rediscovered them, and we write our history in terms of where to belong. Like, you know, you have even Greek life in the United States, which is bizarre. Like all those organizations of fraternities and sororities, which sort of, like, I wasn't in the United States for college, so it really sort of surprised me that there was something like that in the United States. Is anybody, like, you're in college now, so, but you can't be because there is none in, at Earlham, but maybe you transferred from somewhere that had Greek life or something? No? I mean, in Oxford, Ohio, like, really not very far. It's insane. And then we need classics. I mean, we read classics. What we say when we say classics, we read ancient Greece. We don't read classics of Confucius, etc.
One of my friends goes to Indiana University, and he lives in a chapter of Greek life, and it's the biggest like Greek life house by square footage in the US. And it's ridiculous. And I went there, I visited one time 2 years ago, and all of the people in it met together, and we actually read Antigone and talked about it. So just that's not true. That's not true. It's they do not follow there's just not really respect present in any form, but yeah, it's wild.
I mean, of course, it's just the name and a bunch of Greek letters, like all the Greek letters that anybody knows nowadays anyway. But yes, I mean, it has absolutely nothing to do with the Greeks in any form or shape, like other than maybe crazy parties or something like that to get drunk or such. But Greeks did that too. So I think maybe like the Dionysus aspect of it, like this kind of the wine. I mean, they don't drink wine mostly, I think, but.
Hey, you say it has nothing to do with the Greeks, but then how do you explain the uppercase sigma on the door?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, it has something to do with it. But I don't know whether it actually reflects a Greek lifestyle of philosophy and learning and ideas, or reading Antigone together or something like that, or staging an ancient play or something like that. I think the drinking aspect, I'm pretty sure that's happening from what I observed in Miami University in Oxford. So, but yeah, other than that, Sorry, Olivia. Yes, I correct myself. Okay, so what we are going to do, what time is it? Okay, so we are going to start reading. Read the introduction. It sort of gives you an overall view of what, and it's really short, like 10 pages. But some of her identifications as like evidence, argument, critical attitude, etc. We will read them ourselves critically, in the sense that we attribute certain things to a Western tradition, and then we don't attribute to others. So for example, when you say philosophy is the beginning of critical attitude, now you might say this with just a positive explanation of the pre-Socratic philosophers. You are somehow appropriating it to yourself. So you are implying that other ways of thinking cannot be critical. You are saying only philosophy can be critical because this is historically the beginning of critical thinking. And that's really the problem of saying like, oh, other ways of thinking were also philosophical, in the sense that they were just like us, except we are the first one who named it, and we are much better than they are. We are much more self-conscious, blah, blah. So it's a very complicated discourse, the discourse of sort of colonizing other discourses, namely like making it your own. So she does that a little bit. We'll talk about that, but she also talks very sort of skillfully and very well about how these sources come to us. So she gives all sort of many examples about how these texts and these ideas and these people and these persons are preserved. And you more and more start thinking that it's a question of hearsay. Somebody says this about Heraclitus, somebody else says this, somebody says Heraclitus said this. And then if you hear somebody else say Heraclitus said this, you think like, oh, there is evidence that two people said it, but in fact one heard from the other, so they are actually saying the same thing. So it's always very ambiguous or not very clear the origin of, origin of philosophy. So that actually is interesting, because whatever we consider to be the Western perspective, for the most part in the 21st century, we are really referring to like for 500 years of European history. We are talking about the history of colonialism. When we say Western tradition, we are really talking about the Western imperialist tradition for 500 years. Now, when we include the Greeks, in fact, the story is not very clear at all. We can't even tell a consistent story in terms of who we are historically. So whenever, Germans, especially in 19th century, for example, read the Greeks, they read them like the Germans they are. They are not reading this pristine text of the Greeks that were already there, etc. They are interpreting of an interpretation of an interpretation. So it is very complicated to figure out what we are really talking about. Mostly we are also talking about ourselves, not about the Greeks, and that's going to be another issue. So anyway, so that's only like the first 10 pages, the introduction, and then start with the Milesians, people from Miletus. Miletus is the Greek term. There is a map. You should look at it. You need to figure out where Miletus is. It was not, when you go there, you actually see like it was right next to the sea before, and it was a port. But then over the years, like 2,000 years, it's filled now. So it is actually inland now. It used to be by the sea, but now it's inland. And there's a ancient sort of theater, obviously. And then there's a lot of ruins in Miletus. If you ever want to go, we can definitely go. I go there quite often. So Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes come from there, all from Miletus. So we are going to read all of them for Wednesday, but that's about, I should say, 10 pages too. So actually kind of 8 pages. So the whole thing that we know is like fits in this book into 8 pages. So your reading is from introduction 1 to 12, and then the Milesians 13 to 22. And then we are going to start discuss that. Like as you read, please take notes, write questions, underline and see what you do or do not understand, and come to class with questions. Especially Anaximander. I mean, I will concentrate on Anaximander a lot because he's the one who has the most speculative and interesting sort of ideas with respect to apeiron and the question of justice, etc. And we are going to try to figure out what he is trying to say. Okay? Any questions? Anything? Well, I mean, I'm going to go back and listen to what I just said and try to figure out how obscure it was, and maybe clarify a little bit at the beginning of next. It never works the way it works in my notes. My notes are very clear, but to me only. You should all really take like post-colonial theory, because I think it makes sense when you talk philosophical transition with respect to colonization of European colonization of the world, then it makes more sense. So I'm trying to be sensitive to a discourse that you may not even think about or care about, but yeah. Philosophy can be colonizing too. So, I mean, it is. Okay. We should have face-to-face, then you talk more. So, but I'm certainly happy today we were not face-to-face, that I can speak without the mask.